The ice took her without warning. One moment the trail was solid beneath her boots. The next, the frozen creek bed gave way and she dropped through. Not far, maybe 4 feet, but the cold hit her like a fist to the chest, and the current grabbed her ankles before she could find footing. She went under once, came up, grabbed at the bank with bare hands and pulled herself out onto the snow. She lay there, face pressed into the cold, breathing. Her name was Clara. She was 26 years old. She had been walking for 2 days. The wagon had broken an axle on the switchback above the Vermilion Lakes, 3 hours past Banff, which was already the edge of the world as far as her supervisor at the Dominion Telegraph office was concerned. She had been sent to repair a line fault, routine maintenance, 2 days out and back. The axle had other plans. The driver, a nervous man named Pollard, who smelled of tobacco and poor decisions, had taken both horses and gone back for help. That had been Thursday. She was fairly certain it was now Saturday, though the grey of the sky made it hard to say. She had the repair kit. She had a half tin of hardtack biscuits and some dried venison wrapped in brown paper. She had her father's wool coat, which was 3 sizes too large, and had saved her life at least twice already. What she did not have was a map, because Pollard had kept the map, presumably because he was the one who knew where he was going. She stood up. Her legs were wet to the knee. She had maybe 2 hours before frostbite became a serious conversation. The spruce trees pressed in on both sides of the trail, heavy with snow, and the mountains above her were lost in cloud. There was no sound except the creek she had just fallen into and the distant percussion of something. A woodpecker, maybe, or the wind working on a dead tree. She moved. Moving was the only option. She found the cabin by accident. She almost walked past it, because it sat below the trail level, and the roof had enough snow on it to look like just another hump of white ground. What stopped her was the smell. Wood smoke, faint but real. The kind that meant something recently fed. She stood at the edge of the drop and looked down, and there it was. Log walls, 1 window, a door facing east, a stack of wood under an oilskin lean-to, a pair of snowshoes hung on pegs beside the door. Someone lived here. Someone was home. She scrambled down the bank, half sliding, and knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. The door opened, and the man on the other side was not what she expected. She was not entirely sure what she had expected. A trapper, maybe, grey-bearded and weathered, the kind that appeared in magazine illustrations with a pipe and a philosophical expression. This man was not that. He was large in the way that utility makes a person large, broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving. He was younger than she'd assumed from the cabin. 35, maybe 40. His eyes were the color of river water in November. He looked at her. She was aware, suddenly, of how she must appear, soaking from the knee down, hair frozen at the ends, her father's coat hanging off her like a collapsed tent. "I fell through the creek," she said. "My wagon broke. My driver left." He said nothing. "I need to warm up," she said. "My feet are. I need to get warm." He stepped back from the door. It was not an invitation, exactly. It was more like the absence of a refusal. She went in. His name was Sutter. She found this out not from him. He offered nothing voluntarily, but from a letter tacked above the workbench, addressed in an official hand to M. Sutter, Lot 14, Bow Valley Survey. He caught her reading it. She didn't apologize. He didn't say anything about it. The inside of the cabin was 1 room, a stove, a table, a shelf of provisions, a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder, hides stretched on frames, a rifle on wall pegs, traps hanging from the rafters, which meant the ceiling smelled faintly of rust and old blood. A tin mug on the table, half full of something that was probably tea. He gave her dry socks. He said nothing while he gave them to her, set them on the table and turned back to the stove. The socks were hand-knit, dark grey wool, too big for her. She put them on and felt the blood begin to make its cautious return to her toes. "How far to the next station?" she asked. 2 days. Walking? In good conditions. She looked at the single window. The light coming through it was the color of old pewter, and getting darker. "There's a storm coming," he said. She already knew. She'd seen the pressure in the clouds since mid-morning, the way the jays had gone quiet. She just hadn't wanted to say it out loud. How long? Don't know yet. She sat by the stove with her socks drying and her hands wrapped around a mug of his tea, and she thought about Pollard, who had probably made it back to Banff by now, and was probably warm. She thought about the line fault, still unrepaired somewhere out there in the frozen right-of-way. She thought about her supervisor, who would assume she was dead and file the appropriate paperwork. He was that kind of man. "I can work," she said to Sutter's back. "While I'm here, I'm not going to sit and wait." He turned enough to look at her over his shoulder. It was a measuring look. Not unfriendly, exactly, but not warm either. "You can check the east snare line in the morning," he said. "If the storm holds off." "All right." "Can you work snowshoes?" "Yes." He turned back to the stove. It was not a conversation. But it was something. The storm did not hold off. It came in overnight, not howling, which was somehow worse, just a steady obliterating pressure that packed the window with white and made the door difficult to push open. By morning the snow was over the porch railing and still falling. The creek she'd gone into was no longer a creek, but a suggestion of lower ground beneath 2 feet of new white. They were not going anywhere. Clara was not a person who frightened easily. She had grown up in Winnipeg, the oldest of 4, in a house where her mother's health meant that she had been the one to chop kindling at age 9, and navigate the school board at age 11, and negotiate with creditors. When her father's heart gave out and left them an inheritance of mostly debt, she had taken the Telegraph job because it paid more than the alternatives, and because she was good with her hands, and because it kept her moving, which was the only management strategy she'd found for the particular variety of loneliness she carried. But being trapped in a small space with a silent man she did not know, that was a different kind of problem. The way she watched everything she didn't understand, carefully. He moved efficiently, without waste. He didn't slam things or sigh. He maintained the stove, checked the smoke drawer, kept the wood box full. When he cooked, a salt pork and dried pea soup that was better than it had any right to be, he cooked enough for 2 without being asked. On the second day, she found his books. There were 11 of them on the shelf between the provisions tins. Spines, outward, survey reports, a natural history of the Rockies, a water-stained copy of Rob Roy, a manual on trap setting that looked like it had been read to pieces, and tucked sideways on top, a collection of verse that she recognized, Pauline Johnson, the Mohawk poet, Flint and Feather. Clara had a copy herself in her kit bag back with the broken wagon. She pulled it out without thinking, and he noticed everything. "You've read her?" Clara asked. "Some. I saw her read once. In Winnipeg. She wore a buckskin dress, and the crowd didn't know what to do with her." Clara paused. "I thought she was magnificent." Sutter looked at her for a moment, then at the book in her hands, then back at the snow pushing against the window. "She was," he said. It was more words than he'd said since she'd arrived, combined. By the 3rd day, she understood him better, or at least understood the shape of what she didn't know. He had been here, in this specific cabin, on this specific lotter, for 3 years. She gathered this from the notches on the doorframe, one for each winter, which was either a practical record-keeping system or the loneliest thing she'd ever seen, and possibly both. He trapped for income. He did occasional work for the survey teams as a packer, carrying equipment into terrain where horses couldn't manage. He appeared to have no connection to town that wasn't purely transactional. "Do you go in to Banff?" she asked. "Twice a year." "That's enough?" He considered this the way he considered most things, slowly, without performing the consideration. "Mostly," he said. She thought about what mostly contained, whether it ever kept him awake. She had her own version of it, the way that moving constantly meant she never had to find out what happened if she stopped. whether she would discover she had nothing at the center. She wondered if Sutter's cabin was the same thing, geographically expressed. She didn't say this. She was self-aware enough to know. It was too much to say to someone she'd known for 3 days in a blizzard. Instead, she asked if she could re-splice the door hinge, which was pulling from the frame and letting in a cold draft. He had the tools. She had spent 2 years making field repairs on telegraph line in temperatures that made this storm look polite. He watched her work, not hovering, just present. There was a quality to his attention that was different from being watched in a way that made her self-conscious. It was more like being considered. "That'll hold the winter," he said when she was done. "It'll hold longer than that if you re-drive those anchor screws in the spring." "I know, I'm just saying." "I know," he said again, but this time there was something different at the edge of it. Not quite amusement, something adjacent. She went to bed in the sleeping loft. That night. He'd given it to her on the first night and taken the floor himself, which she'd argued about briefly and uselessly. And she lay looking at the low-pitched roof and thought about the telegraph fault still waiting in the frozen right-of-way, and about her supervisor filing his paperwork, and about what it would mean to go back. She thought about it for a long time. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. The storm broke on the 4th morning. She woke to silence, which after 3 days of wind was so complete it almost had a sound of its own. The light through the window was the sharp pale blue of clear cold, the kind that meant 20 below and not a cloud in sight. Sutter had the stove going and coffee on when she came down the ladder. They didn't speak much at breakfast. The silence was different now, easier, worn smooth by 4 days of proximity. She knew that he took his coffee without sugar, and that he always added a small amount of wood before bed to keep the stove from going cold before morning, and that when he was thinking, he had a habit of running his thumb along the back edge of whatever tool was in his hand, just pressing the flat of the nail against the steel. After breakfast, she went out with him to check the east snare line. The snow was hip-deep in the open and compressed in the shadows of the trees. She was on snowshoes. His spares, ash frame, old but serviceable, and she kept pace with him, which he seemed to register without commenting on. The world was very white and very still, and very large. She had grown up where the prairie made you feel exposed, like a figure on a blank page. This was different. The mountains contained the space rather than opening it. And she found she didn't feel small here. She felt situated. They found 3 rabbits and a marten in the snares. He showed her how to reset the trigger without losing the tension. She watched once, then did it herself. He made a small sound of acknowledgement that she suspected was the closest thing to enthusiastic praise he produced. "The telegraph station," she said, on the way back, her breath visible in the cold air. "The line fault I was sent to fix. It's somewhere above the 3rd switchback. There'd be a splice kit in my bag, if the wagon's still there. Probably still there. I should get to it before the survey season starts. They'll need the line." 2 days out, he said. "From here, following the creek. 1 hard day back if the snow packs. Will you take me?" He was quiet for a distance. The snowshoes made a soft compression, with each step like an intake of breath. "After I run the west line," he said. "Tomorrow," she nodded. They walked back. They reached the broken wagon on the afternoon of the 2nd day. The axle had come down off the switchback in the snow, and the whole rig had listed to one side like a boat taking water. But the kit bag was there, frozen into the footwell but intact. The repair tools were there. The spare connectors were there. The splice took her most of the following morning. Working in the cold with her hands in light wool gloves, standing on the folding ladder she'd pulled from the kit, reading the fault by its brake signature, the way other people read text. Sutter stood below with the horses they'd borrowed from a packer's cache half a day back, saying nothing, which was exactly what she needed him to do. When the circuit closed and held, she climbed down. "That's it," she said. "You're certain?" "Yes." She began breaking down the ladder. "I've been doing this for 4 years. I know what a clean connection sounds like." He took the ladder from her and folded it the rest of the way and secured it to the pack without being asked. Small thing. She noticed it anyway. The ride back was easier than the walk out. The horses moved well on the packed trail, and the sky stayed clear, and the temperature came up enough that she could feel her fingers properly by midday. She rode behind him on the trail, close enough to talk if she'd wanted to, far enough to think. She thought about Banff, which was a day and a half from Sutter's cabin in decent snow. She thought about the Telegraph office, which would need her report. She thought about her supervisor, who was going to say something insufferable about women in the field, which he said every time she returned from an assignment, and she was going to have to decide, once again, whether it was worth the argument, or whether she should just file the report and leave for the next job. There was always a next job. She thought about that too. They came back to the cabin at dusk, on a day that had turned briefly golden before the cold closed in again. The horses went back with a note to the packer's cache, carried by Sutter's dog, a big, mixed-breed animal named for the sound he made when he wanted breakfast, which sounded to Clara like Brock, who returned 3 hours later, looking pleased with himself. She sat at the table that night with her hands around her mug, and the lamp throwing its yellow circle on the walls, and she thought, "There is a stage south of here, running twice weekly to Banff." The schedule had it coming through the Vermilion cutoff on Tuesdays, and Fridays it was Monday. In the morning, she could wait by the road. She looked at Sutter across the table. He was working on a broken trap jaw, reshaping it with a file, his attention on the work. The fire snapped once. Brock sighed and shifted his weight in the corner. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. She could hear it in the way the walls contracted, small sounds like the wood was settling into itself. "The hinge on the north side of the loft hatch," she said. "It's the same problem as the door was. If you leave it through another winter, it'll pull clean out of the frame." He looked up. "I noticed when I came down this morning," she said. "I can fix it before I go, if you have the hardware." He looked at her for a moment with those river water eyes. "There's a tin of screws on the second shelf," he said, "behind the coffee." She nodded and looked back at her mug. "The south-facing slope above the cabin," she said. "The snow load up there. If you get another storm like this last one, there's going to be slide risk. You should put in an anchor post, angle it about 30 degrees off the slope line." "I know. You keep saying you know things. Because I know them. Then why haven't you done it?" He set the trap jaw down and looked at her. Not with irritation, exactly, but with the look of a person whose calculations are being interrupted by someone else's data. "Because there's only one of me," he said. Clara held that. She turned her mug in her hands. Outside, the wind was picking up again, pushing against the north wall. "There's a stage on Tuesday," she said. "I know. That's tomorrow." "Yes." She set her mug down on the table. She looked at the lamp. She thought about Banff, and her supervisor, and the next assignment, and the particular apartment in Calgary. She kept coming back to between jobs. The one with the single window facing an alley, the one she'd never quite bothered to make feel like anything. "I'm going to fix the hatch in the morning," she said. "And then I think you should show me where you want the anchor post." He was quiet for a moment. "The stage only runs twice a week," he said. "I'm aware of the schedule." Another beat of quiet. The fire settled. Brock lifted his head and then put it back down. "There's a good stand of timber for a post," Sutter said finally, "about 200 yards up the south draw, straight-grained. It'll hold." "All right," Clara said. She picked up her mug. He picked up the trap jaw and the file. They sat like that for a while, the two of them in the yellow lamp circle, while the cold worked at the walls from outside, and the dog slept in his corner, and the mountains held everything in place the way mountains do. Steadily, without being asked. She didn't take the Tuesday stage. There would be another one Friday, and then next week. The schedule was reliable. That was the whole point of a schedule. The hatch hinge took her most of the morning, and when it was done, she went out into the cold, and Sutter showed her the stand of timber he meant, and she looked at the angle of the slope and the snow load above and thought he was right about the post placement, and told him so, which he received without visible disgust, but shot the timber together. They cut the timber together. It took the rest of the day, and she was very tired, and her hands ached, and when she pulled off her gloves at the door, she saw that she'd raised a blister on the heel of her right palm from the axe handle. Sutter saw it too. He went inside and came back with a small tin of rendered fat and a strip of clean linen, and set them on the table without comment. She dressed her own hand. She did not need help, but she noticed that he waited nearby until she was done, doing nothing in particular, which was as close to hovering as she suspected he was capable of. "Thank you," she said. He put his coat back on and went to bring in the evening wood. She sat at the table with her hand wrapped and the tin of fat still open, and she thought, this is not the life she planned. This is not the life she had a name for. But the particular silence of this cabin was different from the silence of the Calgary apartment. This one had texture. It had the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and the dog's fur drying by the stove. It had Sutter's footsteps on the porch and the sound of wood landing in the box, and in a moment the door opening again and the cold coming in briefly before it didn't. She closed the tin. She got up to start supper because it was her turn, and she'd learned, somewhere in the last week, to make his dried pea soup better than he did. She added a heel of hard thyme and a pinch of dried on the third shelf, which he hadn't mentioned was there but which she'd found on the second day. And she stood at the stove and listened to him stack the wood on the porch, even and steady, and thought that the survey season started in April. She knew the telegraph routes. She knew which lines needed work. She could write to the district office from here. Sutter had paper and ink, and request reassignment to the Bow Valley corridor, which would need a field technician through the spring and summer and probably the fall. It was a reasonable request. The district office respected reasonable requests. She stirred the soup. The door opened. Sutter came in with snow on his shoulders, and the cold following him, and Brock raised his head and wagged once without getting up. Sutter pulled off his coat and hung it on the peg, and looked at what she was doing at the stove. "You added something," he said. "Time. You had it on the third shelf. I hope that's all right." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out the bench and sat down at the table. "Sit. It's all right," he said. Outside, the last of the light was going out of the sky. The high cold blue fading to something softer, almost violet, the mountains going to dark shapes above the tree line. The lamp needed trimming, but it was giving enough light. The soup was starting to smell like something worth eating. She didn't take the Friday stage either.